Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for also organizing, and thank you for your participation. And thank you for taking the time to be in this workshop this afternoon. I'm dialing in today from Leipzig in Germany, but I am originally from Kenya, and I've got family also in Leipzig. So I'm going to start off our session with a poem. And I believe throughout the conference so far, you have been challenged. And my intention today with this workshop is to basically keep firing up your curiosity, as well as, provide you with some questions, which you can then carry forward into the work that you're going to do tomorrow, especially as far as thinking and challenging the development stereotypes. Okay, so come along with me on this ride, and let's start off with the poem. So the poem is called The Development Set, and it was written by Ross Coggins in 1976. Excuse me, friends, I must catch my jet. I'm off to join the development set. My bags are packed and I've had all my shots. I have traveler's checks and pills for the trots. The development set is bright and noble. Our thoughts are deep and our vision global. Although we move with the better classes, our thoughts are always with the masses. In Sheraton hotels in scattered nations, we damn multinational corporations. Injustice seems easy to protest in such seething hotbeds of social rest. Next slide, please. We discuss malnutrition over steaks and plan hunger strikes during coffee breaks, whether Asian floods or African drought. We face each issue with open mouth. We bring in consultants whose circumlocution raises difficulties for every solution, thus guaranteeing continued good eating by showing the need for another meeting. The language of the development set stretches the English alphabet. We use swell words like epigenetic, micro, macro, and logarithmetic. Next slide. It pleasures us to be esoteric. It's so intellectually atmospheric. And although establishments may be unmoved, our vocabularies are much improved. When the talk gets deep and you're feeling numb, you can keep your shame to a minimum to show that you too are intelligent. Smugly ask, is it really development? Or say, that's fine in practice, but don't you see, it doesn't work out in theory. A few may find this incomprehensible, but most will admire you as deep and sensible. Development set homes are extremely chic, full of carvings, curios, and draped with batik. Eye-level photographs subtly assure that your host is at home with the great and the poor. Enough of these verses, on with the mission. Our task is as broad as the human condition. Just pray God the Bible promise is true. The poor ye shall always have with you. Yeah, so this poem was written in 1976, but the first time I came across it, I think it was about 2 years ago, I was really shocked at how relevant it is to the work that we do today, particularly when you think of critiquing and looking at the work of the development sector from a different perspective. So as we get into the content or the theoretical understanding of the development stereotypes that we're familiar with, I'd like us to take a step back in history and just sort of reflect on the origin of international development. I'm not going to stay long with that, but I think it's important so that we have a good understanding for the basis as to why the stereotypes are there in the first place. So when we look at international development, it first emerged at the end of World War II. And this was also the time when European colonialism was almost coming to an end in many of the African, Asian, Latin American countries. They were gaining independence, independence on paper, but not necessarily entirely political or economic independence. And this is around the same time that the United Nations was also created to maintain peace, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems, be they social, economic, or humanitarian. And at this point, much of the world, especially when we talk about the Black, Brown, Asian, and Latino communities, they were framed as being underdeveloped because we had sort of the Western countries, the former colonizers, sort of being defined as being the developed countries. And so then we start seeing associations between the Black, Brown, Asian, and Latinos as the poor ones. And then we've got the whites as being the rich people. And what we're starting to see at that point is that we're ignoring already the poverty that exists also in the richer societies. So in one of the other slides after the poem, there's a concept called the white gaze of development. Yes, this one, thank you. So we start basically to see what Robtel Nyajay Paley, and she is a Liberian activist and a professor. She defines the white gaze of development as basically measuring Black people and people of color against a perceived higher standard of whiteness and finding them severely wanting. So this white gaze of development is basically exactly what we start seeing when it comes to perceiving, people of color as being poor and whites as being rich. And this binary interpretation of the world continues till today because we continue using words like developing versus developed, global south versus global north, local versus global, beneficiaries versus donors. But what is really the underlying message is that there's a lot of us versus them, that is being carried in the language. And the challenge with this, amongst many others, which I'm going to get into, is that we continue ignoring sort of the indigenous knowledge that non-colonial institutions, which are considered informal, that they don't carry as much weight or that they don't carry as much importance, whereas the formal ones, through the Western lens, they carry the power. And that way we continue, we could continue sort of deepening this stereotypes around who has power and who does not have power, or this narrative, actually, it's more of a narrative. Yeah. And we're also starting to see, who is an expert in tackling the imbalances. So the people who have the money start being associated with the expertise, with the knowledge, with the worldview that is required for progress to happen as far as development is concerned. And therein, the whole idea of white saviorism starts to emerge. White saviorism is basically the belief that white people have the capacity to end poverty, to tackle climate change, to save Black women and children from hunger, conflict, and violence. And in one of the slides, the next one after this one, I basically outline, yes, this one, that the dominant narrative, according to white saviorism, is that you've got a poor person and then a donor comes in and gives the gift of money. And then what happens to the poor person? They're supposed to be happy because the donor money is sort of like a magic wand. Yeah. And this simplistic narrative that underpins a lot of the work that we do, it is very disempowering in the sense that poor countries are then understood as being poor because of bad governance or institutional corruption, or it's an autocratic regime which needs democracy so that things can improve. And rich countries are rich because of their own hard work and brilliance, so there is a moral obligation to give to the poor. So this dominant narrative, we can see that it's translated a lot in the way that we communicate. And I think the exercise that you started with looking at the visual language, the way that we communicate the work that we do is really strong in sort of communicating this simplistic narrative that, when World Vision are asking people to contribute to this project on child slavery, that the $10 that you give, it's made to look like once you give that much money, you're definitely going to improve the child's life. But what is really happening behind the scenes is not transparent. And I just wanted to say that, those particular images, they're actually defined as poverty porn. And poverty porn is basically, showing images of people who are in desperate living conditions, or they're in desperate poverty for the sake of showing misery, and I think a lot of you were able to spot that already. And these images, they basically objectify the suffering, and it really takes away the agency of the people in the images away, or the agency also of the communities where those people are from. So these images, what they do is, instead of really counteracting the historical and the politicized ideas of the other, they continue to uphold, they continue to uphold this colonial perspective, this racist perspective of development. And we have to keep in mind that the development sector was basically built after colonialism, and it is very much fueled by racist structures. It's just embedded in the way the sector is built. And that's why we're hearing at the moment a lot of discussions about decolonizing. Yeah. So a lot of harm is done through these images, because a single story is actually what is told in the images, by presenting people as being victims or as being passive and that they need help. And I can't help but think how this particular narrative also played out, during the COVID-19 pandemic, that in a lot of African countries, there was this perception, particularly, in Western countries, that, because of the understanding that African countries, they lack agency and they need help or saving from this part of the world, that, Africans were going to die they were going to, basically complete destruction of populations through the COVID-19 pandemic. But what happened is, I live in Geneva and my parents live in Kenya. What happened was, when I visited them, I was really surprised already that there was a curfew that was instituted in place, that, they were measuring people's temperature the minute you get into the airport, that you had to wear masks much more strictly. It was much more enforced. And you could see the sort of preparedness that had happened was at a much sort of deeper level than what I was experiencing in Geneva. And I think this is informed by the fact that, African countries have dealt with crises like the malaria crisis, or they've dealt with a cholera outbreak, for example. So they have a lot of experience and wealth in terms of the level of preparedness that would be required also to handle pandemics. But unfortunately, in a lot of the richer countries, or in a lot of the Western countries, that's not the narrative that we were seeing. If anything, the narrative that we were seeing was that, populations are going to die there. And yes, and when Omicron came, even though it was discovered in South Africa, it was still like, oh yeah, you South Africans over there, you've engineered a whole new virus. It was not that it was a South African scientist who discovered it in South Africa. So, the narrative, the simple narrative that we see in the development sector, it really takes away the agency it takes away the agency of the Africans or of the communities who are actually also doing the work. I'm going to talk about also the choice of words that we use in the sector, because then this also continues to perpetuate the stereotypes. So let's talk about the word beneficiary, for example. And beneficiary to me is one of those examples of a very jargony word. And when I was preparing for this, I was told that your network is made up of activists who also come outside or who have experience working as medical doctors, or they have not been part of this development bubble, so to speak. So I just wonder what, some of you thought of when you heard of the word beneficiary, because it implies, that there is someone who's receiving a benefit. Yes. And it seems like one of those English words that is probably supposed to be easy to understand. But what is also meant by a beneficiary, or what is implied, is that, this person is passive, this person does not have an opinion, they don't really know what they need, and they're expected to be grateful for the aid, or for the help that they're given, So besides it having those negative implications, it also locks out people, ordinary people, from really understanding the communities who are being served by, the NGOs. Or a word like, expert, expert, EXPERT. When you think of the word expert, I mean, what sort of person do you imagine, For me, when I joined the sector, I just imagined that it would be a white person, and this is me also just coming out to say that, I have internalized, a big part of also the racism that is part of the sector, and it's my job also to unlearn that. So I'm also on that journey. But the point here is that it's very easy to see, or not very easy, but it's very telling, the language that we use and how they perpetuate certain stereotypes. Why is a white person considered an expert and not a person of color, or a Black person like myself? And why is an immigrant considered as somebody who does not have privilege? Yeah, and then another word is, the global South. It's very misleading in the sense that we're lumping also people together. We're lumping, Africans, Asians, and Latin Americans together with, let's say, Australia and New Zealand, who also geographically happen to be part of the global South, so to speak. But above all, it just sort of creates this narrative again as, this one group of people who, they need help from the global North. Yeah. So in the different ways that we have perpetuated stereotypes, through these damaging languages, or through the different images as well, some of the things that come up which are missing, for example, is that the images and the language that we use, it doesn't really convey the connection between the wealth of the rich countries and the poverty of the poor ones. Because when we look at colonialism, it's very clear that it was a very extractive and a very exploitative project. And a lot of the wealth that is in the Western countries right now is actually a product of the raw materials that they basically took from all these majority countries. And when I say majority countries, then I mean the global South. Because if you look geographically at that region, in terms of numbers, definitely the population is much bigger than the minority world, which would be the global North. Yeah. And then the other thing that is missing in this whole conversation is that aid is often presented as being something very benevolent, that in those images by World Vision, or like in Germany, there's another one called Welthungerhilfe, they fight world hunger. It always looks like if I just give this much money, that automatically this person or this child or this community is going to benefit. But what is not communicated are the conditionalities which are attached to that aid or to that money that you give. It's not, unless you start questioning, you don't really see clearly that it's actually a loan, let's say, that UK aid would give to Kenya to support the Turkana community in as far as sexual and reproductive health rights are concerned. And one of the conditions could be something like because we have given you aid, then we expect you to buy weapons from us, or we expect you to get, to get your office cars from a particular country, So what happens in the long run is that it's actually a business, and we have to be aware of that. And that's, as citizens, we need to be able to hold, our governments accountable in terms of just questioning, what are sort of those conditions. Yeah. And there is the former African Union ambassador to the US. Her name is Dr. Arikana Chihombori, and she talks very passionately, and she's very critical of the role of France in relation to the former colonies in West Africa. And Dr. Arikana talks about how France got, the former West African colonies to sign a pact for the continuation of colonization. And these countries include like Benin, Chad, Mali, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and Cote d'Ivoire. And one of the conditions under this pact was that for these countries, they have to put a certain percentage of their foreign reserves into the French central bank, which is of course under the control of the French Ministry of Finance. So Dr. Arikana says that she and her team estimates that France gets up to $500 billion from its former colonies, in terms of interest rates that they have to pay, or maintenance fees that they have to pay whenever they want to access the foreign reserves, which are in the French central bank. So in this case, it makes you question, or it makes me wonder, who is really the beneficiary here? Because if you think of French aid that they're providing to these West African countries versus the amount of money that they actually get for keeping or for insisting that the countries have to keep their foreign reserves into the French National Central Bank, I think it's really a fraction. And for me, it starts sort of shifting the narrative away from France, providing so-called aid, but actually France being a beneficiary of the wealth that is coming from the West African countries. So what can we do when it comes to sort of challenging and shifting this narrative as well? So when it comes to, word choices, what I try to do, as a Black woman and as a communicator, I try to make sure that I'm interrogating each story that I'm telling by asking myself, who am I excluding when I use certain words? Am I the right person to tell a particular story, or can I get someone else from the community to actually tell the story instead of me? And I also think that one of the things you can definitely do is something that I was involved in, and some of you might be aware of Health Poverty Action, which is an NGO that is also based in the UK. And they had a campaign which was called A Time to Rename Aid. And it was focused on finding alternatives to the word aid, Like, for example, in Germany, they abandoned the word aid to cooperation. And I acknowledge that language alone is not enough, but poverty is really about the lack of power. And the current language that we use is still very rooted in colonial origins of the sector, but we're really in a political struggle. So when it comes to renaming aid, in this campaign by Health Poverty Action, we had to come up with alternative words to the word aid, or to the word charity, or to the word development. And some of the alternatives that we came up with are things like redistribution, repatriation, social justice, global solidarity, the equalization fund, the global equity fund. So for us to challenge the power dynamics upon which the sector is built, and the power dynamics which are carried in the language that we use at the moment, I think if we can commit to choosing one of these words, repatriations, for example, the repatriation sector, and say, let's do that for 1 month, and see how that is going to change the way that we run our organizations, I think that we could see a change in the way that we operate, in the way that we relate with our partners, in the way that, you know, many of you also run your campaigns. Yeah. And the other thing that I think we can do, and I'm sorry, my emphasis in terms of what to do is really heavy on communication, just based on my background, is that you can audit also your campaigns or your communications, to sort of understand the internalized and often unconscious nature of racism, because I think it can be very sneaky in terms of the way that, you know, you write proposals or the way that you expect evaluations to be done. So when you carry out an audit, let's say of the communications, then language kind of becomes an entry point. But then you're also starting to understand that, for example, in your annual reports, who are you centering in there? Are you centering the donors who've given you money, or are you centering the communities that you're working with? Yeah. And then the other thing that would, you know, is helpful when it comes to moving away from oppressive language and more towards inclusion, besides the language, is just a recognition that this process is long-term, and you can start, you know, with the communication department, but then it has to seep down into the organizational culture, into the values, you know, to the point of, you know, the leadership also believes in this whole agenda, where you can also choose to have dignity and allyship and other anti-racist values as part of the metrics of success in your organization. And I know that Results UK, I know that you are working together with my friend Natalie Latte on this process. And I believe that you are an organization who is also ready for the discomfort, who is ready to strengthen that will internally so that you can actually make a difference. So to end, I'd like to just emphasize the three things that I'd like you to take away. So the first one is that, you know, the process of breaking away from these stereotypes and making campaigns inclusive and actively against oppression has to be owned by all of us. And by all of us, I mean both Black and white and brown and, you know, across the board. This has to be a process that we all recognize, because at the moment, you know, the standard of progress is very white, is very perceived, has been defined, you know, through a white gaze, you know. So we have to be intentional about unlearning and learning, you know, about how colonialism and racism plays into the sector. And when we recognize that this is our responsibility, you know, then it becomes sort of an emancipatory endeavor for all of us. You know, for me, unlearning, and for the white folks also unlearning and learning, and not necessarily putting the burden on your Black or brown colleagues to, you know, to lead the process, but just taking the step and realizing that there is a different and alternative way of doing things. The second point is that we need to recognize that the current narrative, it encourages an imposition of a Western worldview. So as I mentioned, who are you centering in your communication? And how do you define what development is? Are you open to other definitions of development, which, you know, the communities that you work with would define development? Because I'm sure if I went, let's say, to the Turkana community in northern Kenya and asked them, how do you define development? Or do you think you're being affected by climate change? I mean, first of all, the language, the technical bit, you know, they're not going to understand, but they have a way of understanding the environment is changing. They have a way of understanding, you know, these are sort of the things that we need so that we can progress in our society. So being open to those alternative views. And the third point is that, you know, this is really a political struggle that we're part of, that we're in, okay? And as I mentioned, poverty is really about lack of power. And for us, in acknowledging that our language at the moment in the sector is not doing justice to the issues of justice that we want to address, the social justice that we want to address, then we really have to find language that is going to speak to the cause that we want to achieve, the equality, the global poverty that we want to fight against, basically the equality that we want to work towards. Can we call our work, can we switch more to a language of equality? And that way, we are also reframing our mindsets, we're reframing the work that we're doing on a daily basis. Yes. And to end, I'm going to leave you with a quote by Lillian Watson, just to continue encouraging you that, if you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions, so I'll turn to the room first.
You have a question?
Yes,
okay.
please.
So,
sorry.
So thank you, Joanna. I found that really inspiring and really helpful and brilliant. But I'd like to challenge you, because what I would really love is if results became a movement across the UK, if there was a UK-based end global poverty movement. And for that, I'd need to kind of recruit all of my friends and all the people I know, not all of whom are middle class, not all of whom are very intellectual. So when I was a kid, I went to school and I was taught about the third world. And when I was in my 20s, I was taught the third world was not really an appropriate phrase to use, thank you very much. And I was taught to say the developing world. And now I'm in my 50s, I've been taught to use the term global south. But this afternoon, you've taught me that global south isn't really very appropriate. And you've also taught me not to use the term beneficiary or expert. So I think all of this is really, really good, I approve, but there's a danger that it's a kind of intellectual middle class tyranny. And I want to recruit every Tom, Dick and Harry and Sally and Bethan and everybody else, you know what I mean? You talked about the language serving our cause. I want everybody in on ending poverty, and I'm a little bit concerned that we intellectualize and middle classize quite a few people out of it by continual scrutiny of the language we use.
Yeah, thanks so much for that point as well. And I can totally agree with you that it has changed over the years, but I think it's also changing because there is a certain degree of reflection that is ongoing in the sector. And I think you're in a good position if you want to recruit, your colleagues or your friends, that right now, with this awareness or with this confusion that I've just brought in, that you would then find a word that speaks to the cause that you want to achieve. Because when we think of the third world and we contextualize, where that came from, actually, I think it was after this, I think it was during the Soviet Union that, we had sort of different factions as far as, Russia is concerned, and sort of the US and Europe being together in one faction, and then the third world being there. So then you can see like global politics is shifting. But I think when you choose a word to describe the sector or to describe the cause that you want to do, be it, let's say, if you want to fight poverty, and you approach it from the understanding that poverty is not really only about helping, because there are so many structural issues which are also involved in addressing poverty. And if you say you want to go and help, you know, the poor kids in a slum in Kenya, for example, but so sort of just understanding that there is a historical genesis, or there's a historical basis to the poverty that is in that slum and that is anchored, you know, in colonialism, and how you can phrase it to be something like redistribution, the network of redistribution with my friends, such that, you know, the work that you do, it's not just about helping, but it's also going in with this intention that I'm acknowledging what happened in the past, and I would like us to talk about how we can redistribute this wealth so that we can make this society more equal, or so that we can open up opportunities for the youth based on what they need at that point. I hope that makes sense, but my intention was also to sort of provoke the thinking, as you know, as you're rightly doing, because in this work of decolonizing, I can tell you for sure, when I have conversations with colleagues, nobody really has a particularly clear vision on what a decolonized development sector is going to look like. Like, that is not, it's not there. It's for us to build it through such discussion. So I'm happy to hear that, you know, you're engaging with this discussion also at that point. And I hope that my response has sort of encouraged you to, you know, to find a word that will define your cause better, as opposed to, you know, using a word that, yeah, a word that is anchored into the stereotypes that we're trying to move away from. Yeah.
One question online. Yeah. Is there anyone online who has a question? If you just unmute yourself.
Hi. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please. Thanks.
It was really fascinating, Joan, and I really appreciate you hearing your perspective, and totally agree with a lot of it. I also sympathize with the previous guy, because I think it's terminology across various sectors, disability, whatever. Some people are alienated by that changing. But I wonder if you have a dream about the Commonwealth, because I think the Commonwealth could be an amazing organization, but it completely needs to ditch the colonial, the whatever, to somehow have those countries leading a vision for the world. I don't know, it's kind of a sidestep, but think about that. If you have a vision, I'd be really interested, because it's an organization I think could do so much if it could go in a completely different direction. Sorry, so it's kind of, it's sort of a question, but more of a longer question maybe.
Yeah, though Corinne, the way I understand the Commonwealth, I mean, it is sort of like an umbrella of different countries. Do you mean it as an umbrella of different countries, or do you mean it as an organization?
So it is an organization, and actually, and it used to be those who are ex-colonies, British colonies. It's not just now, it's a very wide range. So countries are joining who never had anything to do with Britain, small countries because they don't have a voice else, a loud voice elsewhere. So I just love the fact that this amazing group of nations actually could develop a really loud voice in their own right. And I think that voice isn't heard, which relates to what you're saying. We do not hear that voice. We don't. I search the national newspapers to hear those articles from Nigerian writers, from, you know, we just do not hear those voices. So I think, and it needs to change its name, but I think we need to hear those voices, those independent voices, give their vision for what the world can be, what they can bring to the world, for all of those things. And I think the Commonwealth maybe has potential to be one of those that can be part of their vision.
Yeah. I totally I totally agree with you, Corinne, especially when I think of, a unified voice, because when we think back to 1894, when the colonial powers were randomly dividing up the African continent, I mean, it was by design. It was by design, and what ended up.
Birthday presents. Have this bit for a birthday. It's your birthday. Let's come. Yeah.
Exactly. So when I think of, the impact of those divisions and how they have affected and they continue to affect African countries till today, that I'm sorry, they continue to divide African countries till today. I think I need to cough a bit.
Sorry.
Oh, I already had COVID earlier on this year, so I think I'm fine. But when I think of how African countries today, we don't speak with one voice on so many things. When I think of what's going on in Spain at the moment with the African immigrants, dying at the border, and often I wish that African leaders would actually speak with one voice in those particular places. But I think at the same time, there is a certain recognition, particularly amongst allies, like the allies who exist in Results UK, that this is something that we can do with the diaspora communities of Africans who are part of our network, for example. But I think also in the campaigns that that you're doing, that there is a possibility, there is an opportunity also to feature these voices which might not be heard, because I think often we're ready to feature those maybe who are likely to bring in more money. So then we have to be in a position where we ask ourselves, are we ready then to feature those unheard voices or those unseen voices and maybe make a little bit less money? Because when we talk about even the fundraising, sort of like what images you're going to use to do the fundraising versus the amount of money that is actually going to come in. But I think the audience is ready, ultimately. I think the audience is ready because if we look at the images which were used in the past, the poverty porn where, you had the African child and, mucus running down their nose, they have a flower on their face. We don't see those kind of images today. So the audience, I think, is also evolving to asking for something that is much more ethical. Yeah.
All right, we'll do one more and then we'll wrap up because we're quite over time, but obviously lots to talk about.
Can I open it with a question?
Oh, we have one in the room, but we'll also take yours, Jill. Thanks.
So I'd like to ask whether we at Results should not only take on board all of these lessons about the language we use, but actually go one step further, and whether we should be actually campaigning in support of all the countries that are calling for reparations from the UK, among other rich countries.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question and just be a little bit louder? I didn't hear you.
I was asking whether we should go one step further and whether we should be campaigning for the UK to be giving reparations to countries that have been calling for them, among other rich countries that have also been asked to give reparations.
Okay, that is a good question, though. I'm wondering if that is a question that you would rather have internally. I mean, if you ask me, I would definitely say that that's a campaign that you should definitely be part of, especially in terms of raising the understanding also, or the critical thinking around why reparations, and and basically carrying that forward also as maybe a legacy that also Results UK would like to be known for, you know, that you led or you supported the communities, you led them up front. But I think internally, when you decide that that is an agenda that you want to be part of, by all means, definitely. I mean, I think that it's very, very necessary, because then that is, again, a step in the direction of moving towards challenging this colonial racist narrative to more solidarity and to more towards building this equal sector that we actually want and we actually need. Yeah, because when I think of characteristics, let's say, of white supremacy, and I think of things like, you know, the sense of urgency that is part of the sector, and then I see how that plays out, you know, for me as you know, as a Black woman, and how that plays out, you know, for also white folks, it really shows, you know, it really takes away the element of rest, which is intrinsic to us as human beings, you know. So that you know, white supremacy then becomes a thing that affects all of us. Obviously, for me as a Black person, I would be more affected by it, because I don't have the privileges, you know, a person with white skin has. But ultimately, when we look at other characteristics like a sense of urgency, they really affect all of us. So when we, you know, embark on this mission of tearing apart these characteristics of white supremacy or championing causes like repatriations, then ultimately I think we're moving towards in the same direction, you know, towards a more equal world that, you know, that we would like to see. And I think that we all got into this sector so that we can work towards.
Thanks. And yeah. All right, just one quick question from Jill, and then we need to move on.
It's a question. Do you think it would help Results UK if we were working on UK poverty as well as poverty overseas in this?
Yes, I think so, without a doubt. And I say that because a few years back, I was part of a team that was also instrumental, that was part of an association of researchers based in different European countries, but I was working for the German chapter of this association. And I made sure that when we had the topic of equality, rather inequality, that we had a chapter where we talked about inequality within Germany. And we invited different people, because within Germany as well, there are certain cities where we know that unemployment is extremely high. And I think that that it brought in a lot of nuance to the debate, besides talking about poverty in Kenya or in other parts of the world, in terms of just also realizing that, you know, this is not something that is only affecting, you know, the majority world, but it's something that is also present in our society. And I think when you do that, or when Results UK also does that, then I think it really helps also in the mind to sort of make this bridge. So it's not just us versus them, but it's also recognizing that this is a problem that we have. This is a structural problem that we have. Maybe it manifests differently in other parts of the world, but it's also something that confronts us. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you, Joanne. You've obviously given us all quite a lot to think about and discuss as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for actively participating in this as well, and keep the learning and unlearning journey. I think there's an alternative way of doing things, and this alternative way of doing things needs community. So be in community so that you don't feel lonely, and so that you keep the momentum up as well.
Thank you. Thanks.